All righty, clock up front says it is that time. I may have to work on that after a while. It still says it's 10 o'clock. So this one hadn't got reset yet. So we'll go ahead and get ready to get started. Prayer list. Some things that were not in the bulletin. I understand Lena Bickers is back at the emergency room with some issues. Wanda Howe's brother has been really, really sick. Let's see what we had here. Don Collins' second Achilles surgery is coming up. Misty Harris, sister-in-law of Greg and Tracy Perry. Debbie Scott, apparently, anybody got anything to do? She was making improvements and so, and then Dan Medeiros, did he get released on Thursday? Bulletins?
I was over there Tuesday, he's still with COVID.
Okay, so he's... Okay. So he had been scheduled to go home Thursday, but he's still battling COVID. All right, anybody, any other ones or any other updates? Anybody that's not on those that we haven't mentioned, or anybody got any updates on anything else? Very quiet this morning. No time change, no pancakes today, so. Susan Edwards. Anybody heard anything on Susan? Okay. If not, Pete, would you mind starting us with a prayer? Thanks, sir. All right, we're continuing on to the point. Look at the Gospel of Mark, and we are in chapter 13, and we're in a stretch that we were calling about, Is This the End? All right, pop quiz, refresher quiz. What did we say as we were looking about this section of chapter 13 that was important, or what it was about this chapter? Context, and we talked about how you go in looking at this chapter. That it's sort of important to go into this chapter, especially this section we're in, with your mind clear. Because we talked about if you go in with certain precepts and certain mindsets here, it's going to affect how you see what we look at. You know, we talked about there are those who hold that this section of Mark is all about what's coming up to the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. We also talked that there are those who look at this section as being part about the fall of Jerusalem, part about end times. Even within that group, there are some that goes, well, it's temple, end time, temple, end time, temple, end time. Or there are those some that look at this as strictly prophetic as it relates to end time prophecy. Now, what did we say was part of the problem with this being related to end times and the second coming? It's our refresher section here. What did we say was a problem with that? At this point, the disciples don't really understand much of what's going on, do they? They really don't understand his true purpose, what he's doing. They haven't grasped yet that he's going to be killed within the next week. They don't even know anything, really don't understand the concept of him coming back resurrected this time, much less coming back a second time. Plus, like Barbara said, we also have to look at what? The context. What was it the disciples had just been talking about? The temple building. They had just said to Jesus, look how magnificent this building is. And we talked last week about how the Jewish people held the temple as a national symbol. It was not so much a symbol of faith to them as it was to a symbol of national pride. So all of this together you look at, and it's sort of hard to see this much as end time stuff. All right, let's go to Mark 13, and we'll start at verse 14. Some of this we may have covered last week, but we're going to go back through. Mark 13, beginning at verse 14. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down or go in or get anything out of his home. And a man in the field must not go back to get his coat. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray it won't happen in the winter, for those will be the days of tribulation, the kind that hasn't been from the beginning of creation until now and will never be again. If the Lord had not cut those days short, no one would be saved, but he cut those days short for the sake of the elect whom he chose. Then if anyone tells you, see, here is the Messiah, see there, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. And you must watch. I have told you everything in advance. So last week we talked a little bit about the false prophets, false messiahs, how quickly they came around right after the death of Jesus. And we talked about the things that they did and the people they led astray. So it did not take long for false messiahs or what end time prophecy people would say, antichrist, to come around. The abomination of desolation. The thing in the temple, we were late last week in the class, we talked about that, what happened there and the things that went on with the priest. In Luke's account, Jesus also told the disciples that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that the desolation is near. He didn't say in 2,000 years, 2,500 years, there will be the abomination of desolation. He says what Luke writes down, and we note that Luke is a noted historian, a details man, that in Luke's gospel, he writes down that Jesus said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that the desolation is near. What happened about 37 years after this? Jerusalem was surrounded by the Roman army. Jerusalem was besieged. Nothing going in, nothing going out. And ultimately, Titus just goes in and levels it. The desolation was near. Luke 21, 20 and 21 says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize the desolation has come near. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains, those inside the city must leave it, and those who are in the country must not enter it. How much of that is important if we're talking about the end of time? If Jesus was talking about end time here, why would you flee to the mountains? What good's that going to do? If you're inside the city, leave it. Well, what good's that going to do if everything's blowing up? And those who are in the country must not enter it. Okay. None of that really matters if we're talking about end time here in this chapter in Mark. Only Matthew makes a reference to a coming and an end of the age. We talked last week a little bit about why he may have done so. Matthew wrote his gospel primarily targeted towards a Jewish audience. Mark wrote primarily towards a Gentile audience. And we talked about that's why Mark does some of the things that he did, was his target audience. Matthew, we talked about, targeted towards a Jewish audience, and that's why Matthew's gospel began with what? The whole lineage. So Matthew, in writing his gospel for a Jewish audience, how would they have viewed the destruction of the temple and the destruction effectively of the nation? They would have viewed that as the end of an age. It would have been the end of the age of the Jewish people as a nation. They would likely view the destruction of the temple as a judgment against Jerusalem and the complete end of the Jewish age. For the Jews, it was. At that point, it was the end of the time. Israel came back to being a nation when? 1947. Almost 2,000 years, the nation of Israel is now done after 70 AD. Except for the remnant. But they would have viewed this as the end of the age. That's what we're looking at with that term there. They would have also viewed the end began with the death of Jesus, making the Old Testament covenant obsolete. The end of the Old Testament age became when the Old Testament covenant is no longer in effect because there is a new covenant. It ended with the fullness of the destruction of the temple and cessation of its Old Testament covenantal sacrifices. There was no more sacrifices that needed to be made in the temple because the ultimate sacrifice had been made. The end of that age is now complete. So that's what, Mark's looking at here when you talk about the end of the age. It was the end of the age for the nation of Israel and the Old Testament. How bad was what happened? Jesus now is warning them. Here's what's going to happen in regards to the temple and the siege of Jerusalem. He's telling them, you look at those comments, drop what you're doing, run, don't go back and even get stuff out of your house. This is not just a religious thing, this is a physical warning to his people. You are going to have to leave in a hurry. Ever seen pictures or clips in the news from war scenes where people have literally grabbed up what they had in their arms and gone on the roads and gone on the highways to get out of the country in advance of an attacking force? That's what we're talking about here when Jesus is telling them, you're going to have to go. He's telling them it's going to be quick and it's going to be bad and you better get out. How bad was it? A Jewish general taken captive by the Romans just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 offered this summary. A Jewish general wrote this: all the calamities which had befallen any nation from the beginning of the world were but small in comparison with those of the Jews. He wrote, in the siege of Jerusalem, no fewer than 1,100,000 people died. It was during the time of the Passover when more than 3 million Jews were assembled. More than a third of the people that were in Jerusalem at that time died. In surrounding provinces, another 250,000 were killed. Rome did not, when they felt that they were having to do something, they didn't mess around. They went in and just 250,000 were slain. 97,000 were taken captive, some killed by beasts for entertainment in Rome. Some sent to work in Egypt, others were sold as slaves. The elect were Christians spared by a shortened siege. We talked about Titus he had surrounded the city. They had built a wall so that nothing went in and nothing went out without Roman approval. But there came up something that Titus felt he needed to get back to Rome. So you know what he did? He ended the siege by going in and just bulldozing the town. But that enabled some to survive. Because ultimately, what happens if you siege a town long enough? Everybody starves. The Romans had enough power and enough army. They could have just sat there and waited it out, and then everybody in the town would have died. But the siege was shortened, and that's what it's talking about here. In those days, if it had not been shortened, there would not have been an elect saved. But there was an elect group saved because God intervened and shortened this time. Yeah.
Secular history is interesting because there were a large number of Jews who had converted to Christianity that fled Jerusalem before the siege.
Yeah. Because they were advised to go. But the shortened siege enabled that remnant to be saved. Titus, the Roman general, being called to return to Rome, proceeded to end the siege, and he stormed the city. That comes from Barnes' commentary in the Gospel of Matthew. Titus got called back, and he said, okay, I got to finish this out. So he finished it out and destroyed the city. In Josephus' writings, Josephus wrote, and now, since his soldiers were already quite tired with killing men, and yet there appeared to be a vast multitude still remaining alive, Caesar gave orders that they should kill none, but those who were in arms and opposed them should take the rest alive. But together with those whom they had orders to slay, they slew the aged and the infirmed. But for those that were in the flourishing age and who might be useful to them, they drove them together into the temple and shut them up within the walls of the court of the women, over which Caesar set one of his freedmen as also Fronto, one of his own friends, which was last to determine everyone's fate according to his merits. So this Fronto slew all those that had been seditious and robbers, who were impeached one by another, but one of the young men he chose out of the tallest and most beautiful and reserved them for the triumph. And as for the rest of the multitude that were above 17 years old, he put them into bonds and sent them to the Egyptian mines. Titus also sent a great number into the provinces as a present to them, that they might be destroyed upon their theaters by the sword and by the wild beast. But those who were under 17 years of age were sold for slaves. Now, do we see why Jesus warned those, you need to get out? The Romans went in, and if you were no good to them, what did they do to you? They killed you. If you served no purpose to them, either for slaves or for entertainment purposes, they just killed you then. And then others they took to the Colosseum, used them for entertainment. And they just decided, okay, you could be a slave, you could do this. If they didn't have need for you, they took care of you. Josephus went on, now during the days wherein Fronto was distinguishing these men, there perished for want of food 11,000, some of whom did not taste any food. Through the hatred of their guards bore them, and others would not take in any when it was given them. The multitude also was so very great that they were in want even of corn for their sustenance. Now the number of those that were carried captive during this whole war was collected to be 97,000, as was the number of those that perished during the whole siege, 1,100,000. Otherwise, 1.1 million. He went on to write, the greater part of whom were indeed of the same nation with the citizens of Jerusalem, but not belonging to the city itself, for they were come up from all the country to the feast of the unleavened bread, and were on a sudden shut up by an army, which at the very first occasioned so great a straitness among them that there came a pestilential destruction upon them, and soon afterwards such a famine as destroyed them more suddenly. Josephus even writes, they were here for the feast of the unleavened bread, and then Rome pins them in. It was bad. And you talk about end times for that nation. It wasn't the end time, it was the end of an age. And that was, that is a horrific end. That is a horrific end. All right, let's go on to verse 24. And again, this is one of those sections we're going to talk about your perspective going in, determining how you look and how you see at this. Beginning of verse 24, but in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will be falling from the sky and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds and with great power and glory. He will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near at the door. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Now, there are a lot of theologians, a lot of those with end time views that will say right here, beginning at verse 24, we jump from the end of the city of Jerusalem and the end of the Israel nation, and we jump to end times. What's the problem with that in verse 24, though? Beginning of verse 24 says, but in what? Those days. It doesn't say in a period of time after this happens. It says, but in those days. Now, if you are one of those who goes into this chapter with the thoughts and the views that all of this is about end times, you can make sort of that piece together. But if you're realizing that Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, this statement right here says, but in those days. To me, that references talking about in the time that the temple and the city and the nation are destroyed. The event. Some read from verse 24 on and presume that, one writer said this, some read that from verse 24 on and presume that this must be talking about the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus, because the text says that stars will fall from the heaven and the sun will be darkened and the Son of Man will come in the clouds. But we see that kind of figurative language used elsewhere earlier in the Bible. The question for us is, should we see Jesus as no longer talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but rather now talking here about the end of the world? And again, part of the problem I have with that is you have a group of people that don't understand in some cases, his most basic teachings. They're not really grasping that. How do you expect them to understand something as complicated as end times? They don't really understand the fact yet that Jesus is going to be resurrected from the dead in a week. So it doesn't fit together that he would throw this out for them, something that they really couldn't grasp at this point. And all they've been talking about, think about this, the whole context, as Barbara talked about earlier, mentioning context, the whole context of this discussion surrounds what? the destruction of the temple. Nowhere else in this conversation has Mark written down anything that they ask about the end of the world. They're asking about when is the temple. There are other scriptures that commonly use this style of language to talk about the fall of a nation. Talking about seeing the Son of Man coming in the clouds and the stars falling from heaven. There are other scriptures that have used this style of language to talk about the fall of a nation. Turn with me to Isaiah chapter 13. Isaiah chapter 13. And begin at verse 9. Isaiah 13, beginning at verse 9. Look, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel with fury and burning anger, to make the earth a desolation and to destroy its sinners. Indeed, the stars of the sky and its constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shine. I will punish the world for its evil and wicked people for their iniquities. I will put an end to the pride of the arrogant and humiliate the insolence of tyrants. I will make a human more scarce than fine gold, and mankind more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its foundations at the wrath of the Lord of armies, on the day of his burning anger. Sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it, to what we just looked at? And this was talking about what in Isaiah? Who is the judgment coming on here? Babylon. This type of figurative language is used in judgment against nations. It also sounds, it does sound like the end of the world, but God uses this kind of apocalyptic language to describe the end of a nation. This is why Jesus uses this imagery for Jerusalem. This is the end of the Jewish age, as we were talking about, as they knew it. The nation of Israel is no more for nearly 2,000 years. The temple is destroyed. It was the end of their age. It was the judgment on Israel. But, and again, talking about going in with your perspective and your views into this one, but what about verse 26? What about verse 26? Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Millennialists will look at that verse and said, see, we told you. See, it says he's coming back in clouds with great power and glory. There are also places in the scriptures where God comes in the clouds, and it is a picture of judgment. Matthew 26:64, you have said it, Jesus told him, but I tell you in the future you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Who's he telling that to? That's the high priest he's having that with. Unless he's hiding somewhere, I don't know that Caiaphas is anywhere around, do you? And he said that Caiaphas would see him sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, if you're looking at judgment on a nation and coming in the clouds as looking at judgment on the country, then yeah, Caiaphas could be around to see that. Because we're talking 37 years. But Caiaphas is not there till the end of time. One writer said, none of this language refers to the end of the world specifically, but to God's judgment upon a people's. We must read with an understanding and knowledge of how God uses these pictures of judgment in other places to properly understand what Jesus is teaching here. So the context continues that Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of this Jewish nation. We talked about context and how context was everything. And we also talked about coming into this. Emily, you and I had this discussion of going in open-minded. Because if you go into this with a certain mindset that you think this has to be end-time prophecy that Jesus is talking about, how you look at that is going to lean toward that. You really, if you're going to look at this the right way, need to go in it with an open mind, an open heart, and just say, okay, God, what do you say? What is Jesus saying here? Not what do I want this to say? Now, we don't ever have that problem with Scripture today, do we? Saying, well, I want the Bible to say this, so I'm going to interpret this way. So while we're saying you need to go into this chapter with an open mind and read it openly and consider context and things like that, that would really apply to everything, wouldn't it? When we're studying God's Word, we don't need to go in with our biases and our preset notions. We need to go in with an open mind and an open heart so we see what's being conveyed in His Word. And to get some of this, we need to go into this open-minded, open heart, and see what Jesus is saying here. Because nowhere in the conversation have the disciples asked Him about the end of the world. And really, you know that as from what we've seen of the disciples throughout the Gospel of Mark study, they're not the overly sharpest group here. And they have trouble understanding things even after great miracles. How much trouble did they have understanding things even after Jesus had fed the 5,000? Not once, but He fed crowds twice. And they're still worrying about where food's going to come from. Context. Barbara's word, context. We need to go into this looking at the context, looking at the conversation they've just been involved in and what the disciples were doing. They had just come out. They were over on the hill overlooking the city. They're looking over at the Temple Mount. That's what they're looking at. Webster defines context as the parts of a discourse that surround a word or passage and can throw light on its meaning. If you want to get the true meaning of something, in other words, Webster says, look at what's before it, look what's after it. Or the interrelated conditions in which something exists or occurs, environment or setting. Context determines a lot. Ever walked in on a conversation, you thought you understood what was going on, and turns out you really didn't? Because you weren't privy to the context. You weren't there when the conversation started. So you have no idea what set up the context. The writer said sometimes when you look at the immediate context, you find that a person made an assumption that is not supported by what is said. Here's where the problem we get into a lot of end-time prophecy and premillennialist stuff and all that. Sometimes when you look at the immediate context, you find that a person made an assumption that is not supported by what is said. They'll cherry pick what they're looking at. And this is not just a challenge with end-time prophecy in the Bible. This is a challenge with a lot of our theologies and a lot of things that we look at and a lot of issues that we look at. We can sometimes cherry pick the Bible and make it say whatever we want to say, make it say. Ever seen somebody do that? We need to look at the context. Gregory Bateson said, without context, words and actions have no meaning at all. Barbara, this right? Context is everything. Context is everything. Look at verse 27 again. Back to Mark 13, let's look at verse 27 again. Verse 27, He will send out the angels and gather His elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Okay, anybody else? Anybody got, what's that actually dealing with? What are we trying to figure out here? He will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. There are other places in the scriptures where references to gathering his people are made that do not reflect to end-time prophecy. Deuteronomy 30, verses 3 and 4, that he will restore your fortunes, have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. Even if your exiles are at the farthest in the horizon, he will gather you and bring you back from there. Isaiah 43:6, I will say to the north, give them up, and to the south, do not hold them back. Bring my sons from far away and my daughters from the ends of the earth. Jeremiah 32:37, I will certainly gather them from all of the lands where I have banished them in my anger, fury, and intense wrath, and I will return them to this place and make them live in safety. Ezekiel 34:13, I will bring them out from the peoples, gather them from the countries, and bring them to their own soil. I will shepherd them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines, and all the inhabited places of the land. Lots of places in Scripture where it refers to gathering people back that are not necessarily end-time prophecy related. And then look at verse 30. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Now, those who are on the end-time prophecy scene, the premillennialists will say this verse refers to the abomination of desolation that takes place in the temple future time. They will say that this verse is referring to those who are alive, that when these things begin to take place, this is the generation that will see it. And again, your preconceived notion and how you view this chapter going into it determines how you look at this verse. Now, if we look at this, and Jesus has been talking with the disciples about the temple, the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the nation of Israel, then this has to mean that those are alive at the time that Jesus is talking and giving this message to the disciples. That's the generation he's talking about. Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. There's a key word in that verse. All. If he's been talking about the siege of Jerusalem and the things that occur and related to that, that means that the generation right then is going to see the end of the age that he's talking about. Which again points us right back to what happens in how long? 37 years. 37 years. If you look at the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, roughly 37 years after Jesus makes this statement, this verse fits. This generation, the people who were alive when Jesus was sitting there on the hill overlooking the Temple Mount with the disciples, that generation is going to see the end of the age of the Jewish nation. Those people then. This verse seems to eliminate any idea that this chapter is about the second coming of Christ or the end of the world. And there again, you have to, if you're going to look at that chapter, this chapter and all of this referring to the end of the world, you have to then say, well, he's talking about, everything he's talking about is future. Way future for them. But it's not, we talked about context, it doesn't fit the context of the discussion. They've been talking about the temple. This verse then seems to eliminate that this is about end-time stuff. This is about the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the end of the nation of Israel. What we said the Jewish people would have viewed as the end of an age. Let's go on to verse 32. We got 4 or 5 minutes, so we may get to finish this chapter out. Now concerning that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Watch, be alert, for you don't know when the time is coming. It's like a man on a journey who left his house, gave authority to his servants, gave each one his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to be alert. Therefore, be alert, since you don't know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening or at midnight or at the crowing of the rooster or early in the morning. Otherwise, when he comes suddenly, he might find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to everyone, be alert. Now again, as we look here, those who delve themselves into end-time prophecy will look at that and say, well, see, it has to be talking about the end of time. No, it doesn't. We're still in the context of the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem, and what Jesus is saying here, nobody knows when it's going to happen. Only God himself knows when this is going to happen. He's telling them to be alert, be ready to flee, understand that this is coming, but we don't know when it's coming, but it's coming sometime in this generation. Only God himself knows. Now, with 4 minutes out there, let me throw you a really, really tough theological question. If Jesus is God, how does the Son not know? That's one of those that'll have you thinking over a cup of coffee for a little while. But Jesus is fully God. Jesus is also fully what? At this point, he's fully man. Okay, so we would not know as full humans what's coming in the future. What extent are we talking about when we look at Jesus here being fully man? Is he limited at all by the fact that he's human while he's still God? Like I said, that's one of those theological questions you can stew and ponder on for hours. But it does tell us that only the Father knows. However that works, only the Father knows. The time. Remember, the disciples not only asked how they would know when it was about to happen, but they asked what? When? How do we know and when? Jesus says, only the Father knows that. But he's also told them this generation will not pass away without seeing this. So he's told them it's soon. He says, I can't tell you exactly when. Only God knows that. God knows when is the answer. Writer said the point seems to be that God has not determined the exact hour and day for Jerusalem's fall. What is certain that is it will fall within the lifetimes of the audience listening to Jesus' word. Now that doesn't mean everybody hearing it's going to be alive when it happens, but in general that generation is going to be there. So his recommendation to them is what? Stay alert. Stay ready. Stop right here a minute. Let's jump forward now a couple of thousand years. What is the advice to us as it pertains to his second coming? Stay alert. We don't know when it's going to happen. We can't predict when it's going to happen. But we should always be alert and we should always be ready. My outlook, and you can get yourself all wound up, you can get yourself all scared and afraid. My outlook on Jesus' second coming and how it happens is this. Regardless of whether we understand how it's going to happen or if we do not understand how it's going to happen, if we are prepared for his second coming, it doesn't matter. If we're prepared and we're alert and we're ready, we can misunderstand it. We just know he's coming back. How he comes back, we might get wrong. That's his purpose and his plan. But if we're ready, he will take care of us, and it does not matter. We can be off on a little bit how it's going to happen. Because I've never seen anywhere in Scripture Jesus says, I'm going to give you a quiz on how I'm coming back, and you got to pass it or you don't get into heaven.
You know, we talk about how little the apostles understood. If you look at the conversation in the Scriptures, they're talking
We just need to be ready. If we believe in Him, we're following Him, and we're ready as He commands us to be, how it happens, He will take care of us. Whether or not we get it 100% right in how we believe it's going to happen, as long as we're following Him. And nowhere does He say in His comment, in His word, you got to know this 100% right. And we will stop there. We are out of time, and we will continue on, probably get started in chapter 14 next week.